welcome. In this video, we will be talking about the anatomy of the eye. So we'll be going over all of these different parts of the eye, thanks to our anatomical description that we got from Google Images. We're going to be going over the different parts of the eye and what their functions are. So let's get started. So the outermost part of the eye, which you all probably might have known before this video, is the cornea. So the cornea is the outermost portion of the eye. And its main function is kind of think of the cornea as like the skin of the eye. Because our skin protects our body from the outside world, right? It is our first line of defense from, abrasives, from penetrations, from outside microbes. So think of the cornea as kind of the same function. Since it is the outermost part of the eye, it is the most protective part of the eye. So it will protect the eye. And in addition to that, it will also be the first contact point of light that is passing through the eye, right? So the first contact point of light passing through the eye. So it will bend that light, and the bending of light is a process called refraction. So that is what I want you to think of when you think of cornea. Now, the next thing that we see over here is the iris. So the iris is kind of the next most important functional unit of the eye after the cornea. So, and I also want you to think of this little pupil that is inside of the iris. So we will kind of discuss the pupil and the iris together. So the iris has the function of providing color to the eye. It provides color to the eye, and it controls the size of the pupil. So let's kind of think of it in a forward-facing view. So if we're looking at an eye, we have our pupil, and we have our iris, which is kind of the color that surrounds the pupil. So the iris can either constrict the pupil or it can dilate the pupil. So constriction means the pupil becomes smaller, and dilation means the pupil becomes larger. And one important thing that you should know is that constriction is a part of parasympathetic activation, and dilation is a part of sympathetic activation. And the way the pupil is going to change its shape is via the iris. And the iris is going to be able to do this through these suspensory ligaments. These will just allow us to change the size of the iris. So, the shape of the pupil. The pupil is a small opening in the eye. Light is able to pass through this pupil. It's able to pass through the pupil. So now we have our light that has gone through the pupil, and now we're ending up at the lens. So the lens is the next part of the eye. So the lens's function is very similar to the cornea. It is going to refract light along with the cornea, but most importantly, its main function is to focus light onto the retina. So the retina is here. It is the backmost part of the eye. It is what's really connecting to this optic nerve over here. It's really close to that. So the retina is the innermost part of the eye. And we will get into the function of the retina very soon. So the lens is functioning to kind of bend light and focus it onto that retina. And that's what's allowing us to actually see things. And we'll actually process what we just saw once the retina does its function. But before we get there, let's talk about this chamber over here, the anterior chamber. So if we break this word down, anterior means at the front. So this chamber is found at the front of the eye. And this chamber is basically between the iris and the cornea. So between the cornea and, or sorry, not the iris, the lens. So between the cornea and the lens, we have the anterior chamber. And this chamber has a lot of aqueous humor. So this is like kind of the watery part of the eye. And is going to provide the eye with a lot of nutrients and nourishment. So let's just include that. Nutrients and nourishment. And then before we enter the retina, we have something called the vitreous chamber. And this can also be called the posterior chamber. So posterior meaning back. So this is going to be between the lens and the retina. So this is kind of the division of the back of the eye. Now, what is vitreous humor? Like, what is the function of that? So vitreous humor is very similar to aqueous humor, except it is this gelatinous, let me switch my pen. It is the gelatinous substance at the back of the eye, whereas the aqueous humor is at the front of the eye, right? So that is what the vitreous chamber is doing. Now we see this other thing, and it's called the sclera. The only thing that you really need to know about the sclera is that the sclera is the white of the eye. So if we go down here and we see an eye, excuse my drawing skills, this white part is the sclera. So this is our front view of an eye. So that is what the sclera is. Now we can talk about the retina. So the retina is the back of the eye. And this is where our light is focused. This is where our image is formed. But in order to understand what we just witnessed, we need the retina to function properly. So how the retina functions is that it converts these light inputs into electrical impulses that can then be broken down by the brain, specifically by the occipital lobe. That's why you see over here the optic nerve, which is kind of going to send all of this information to the occipital lobe so we can process the visual input that we just got. That's why it is kind of leading into the retina over here, right? So the retina is leading into the optic nerve, which is then going to go to the occipital lobe, so then we can process what on earth we just saw. Now there's a part of the retina, and it's called the fovea. So the fovea is the part of the eye where there are only cones, and there are no rods. So what are rods and cones? So let's go over that real quick. So cones and rods are both photoreceptors, and cones are a type of photoreceptor that respond to color. So the way I remember this is that CO in cones stands for CO in color. And rods are not involved with color, but they're involved with light versus dark. So if you're in broad daylight, you can see all these different colors, and that's because the cones are activated. But if you are in the dark, these rods are activated so that you can have night vision and you can kind of make out shapes in the dark, but you don't have as much focus in the dark. You can't really make out all of those colors in the dark. And that's why the cones are not active in the night, but the rods are more active at night. So now that we know what rods and cones are, fovea is a part of the retina, specifically, it is part of the eye called the macula. And the fovea is kind of the center of that. and it contains no rods but only cones. That means that it is only responding to very high detail images and colors. So this is where the highest detail of an image gets formed. Now we can talk about this optic nerve over here. So the optic nerve is going to meet our retina so that we can send this input into the brain. But where the optic nerve is crossing over here, there are actually no rods and no cones either, because we needed to make space for the optic nerve to meet the retina over here, right? To kind of meet the eyeball over here. So that's why we don't have any rods or cones. So that's why this area is called the blind spot. We're running out of space here. Sorry about how messy it is. This is called the blind spot, right? Because there's no rods or cones here because our optic nerve is passing through here. We need space for the optic nerve to pass through. So that is why that area is called the blind spot. So there you have it. Those are the main parts of the eye that we care about right now. And let's do a quick overview just to make sure we understand what we just talked about. So light is going to come in, it is going to start passing through the cornea, which is going to bend the light, right? And then it's going to go through the iris, which is able to control the pupil, which is in the center of the iris, and then the light is going to go pass straight through the pupil. Then it's going to hit the lens, which is going to focus light onto the retina. This is where our image gets formed. But in order to process that image, the retina is going to convert these light inputs into electrical impulses that can then be understood by the brain, particularly the occipital lobe. How does it get to the brain? Well, that's why we have the optic nerve over here. That input and impulses are going to travel through the optic nerve and they're going to end up in the occipital lobe, and that's where visual processing occurs. And then remember, we also have a part of the retina that is called the fovea, where we only have cones, so that is where the highest detail and most color-oriented image will form over there, very high detail. And remember also that since the optic nerve is passing through here, we need to make space for the optic nerve. So that's why we have no rods or cones. So we can't really see in that area, so that's why it is called the blind spot. So I hope that was helpful. Sorry about how messy this video got, but I hope that was helpful, and I'll see you in the next one. Thank you.